saber-toothed megasivet.
Yes.
this is why you're here.
Yes.
Well, hi there. Not long ago, we did a video about the entire clade Ungulata, which is one of the largest and most interesting mammalian clades for sure. And I will mention that I just came back from Africa. And while I was in Africa, I had my first ever experiences with wild rhinoceroses. And so I'm pretty excited about rhinoceroses right now. I did promise that someday in the not so distant future, I will make a video about every member of the larger clade to which the rhinoceroses belong, called the Perissodactyla, the odd-toed ungulates. This is not that video. However, I will run you really quickly through the 5 extant species of rhinoceroses and how they're related to one another. But then I want to back up a little bit because unexpectedly today, Steve from Paleo Analysis, which is legitimately one of my absolute favorite biology YouTube channels I've ever discovered. In fact, I was a huge fan of his channel because of what he had to teach me before I ever met him. And he was just at the door of the reptile room this morning, and I thought, I'm so excited about rhinoceroses right now. He has just been out on a dig site finding rhinoceroses. North American rhinoceroses, mind you. And I have so much to learn from him. And now I get to do it in real life. But I promised you really quickly, I will go through the 5 extant species of rhinoceroses. Today, there are no extant North American rhinoceroses, though there used to be a ton of them. Today we have 3 species in Asia, the Sumatran, the Indian, and the Javan rhinoceros, and 2 species in Africa, the black rhinoceros and the one that I just got to have experiences with, the white rhinoceros. The white rhinoceros and the black rhinoceros are each other's closest relatives. And among the Asian rhinoceroses, they're also most closely related to one another, with the Javan and the Indian being more closely related to one another than they are to the Sumatran. But again, all 3 of those are more closely related to one another than they are to either of the African rhinoceroses. And then the rhinoceroses, among other extant organisms, their closest relatives are the tapirs, and then after that, the equids. That's where they fall, a stinking rad group characterized mostly by essentially a giant fingernail growing out of their nose. And as cool as they are, and as much as we are going to talk more about them very soon when we do talk about every single species in the Perissodactyla, today I'm going to pick Steve's brain about these extinct ancient rhinoceroses because they got to be some of the coolest, at least mammals, that have ever lived. So Steve, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for bringing this with you.
Yep.
What is this?
So this is actually bits of fossil from a rhinoceros that I have been digging on for the past 3 years in the White River Badlands.
That's this rhinoceros.
That is this rhinoceros. Not only is it this species of rhinoceros, but I'm fairly certain that we are looking at a bunch of remains from a single individual rhinoceros.
This same individual.
Yes.
And what is this?
This is the tusk of this species of rhinoceros called Subhyrachodon. They had 2 small tusks in the bottom jaw that we think that they were using as a tool for rooting. Okay,
now tusks or tusk-like teeth are very common in the Ungulata. Mm-hmm. Do you know which teeth these are?
Yes. So in a lot of the ungulates, the tusks are normally basically the same teeth as the canine teeth, or in the case of humans, the eye teeth that we have. But in the case of the rhinos, it's actually their very front under lower jaw incisors.
Okay, which that happens in a few groups.
Right, yes. So in the case of these, as well as a couple of later species that are fairly closely related to this guy, we see that kind of trend continuing with a lot of the North American species, even up to some of the last species that lived in North America.
Do we not see that as much in the Asian or African rhinoceroses?
In the African species, we do not. But in the Asian species, we actually do. They're very reduced by comparison to what we see in this species, and then also with some of the later species where they actually became even more pronounced.
Okay, and that makes sense. Given my limited knowledge of extinct rhinoceroses and their relatives, it seems like they're more closely related to the Asian species the three Asian species than they are to the African species. And so the fact that they would share that is really interesting. And what did you say they use those for?
So in the case of these animals that we think that they were using them for breeding. This is an animal called Subhyrachodon.
Okay.
And it is one of
tell me more about
two species that we find at the White River Formation. There's Hyrachodon, which is the smaller of the two species. It's about the size of a goat. So we're not talking.
That is a very small rhinoceros.
Right. Yeah. So
that's rad, and I want one for a pet.
Yes. Also hornless.
Okay.
So a hornless rhino about the size of a goat. That's Hyrachodon. And then we have Subhyrachodon, which is this species, bit larger. It was in between the size of a tapir and a cow. So about 700-800 pounds. The White River Formation is around 37 to 30 million years.
That's where our fish come from, isn't it?
Those fish are actually even older than that. That's from Green River.
Green River,
which is
so
Eocene. So the White River Formation is from the very end of the Eocene into the Oligocene.
Okay. And so about how long ago is that for people?
So from about 37 to about 30 million years ago is the age of these fossils. Where I hunt is around 34 to 30. So there's a couple of lower layers, and in those lower layers, these rhinos are less common. And there's a very specific reason why we think these rhinos became more common as we get later into the White River Formation. So there was another very rhino-like group of parasitactyls that was around at the end of the Eocene called the Titanotheres.
Were they convergently rhinoceros-like, or are they similar? Or are they closely related?
They are closer related to rhinos than horses.
Okay, but you don't know about
tapirs are closer related to rhinos than the Titanotheres.
Very cool.
But they, in some cases, a Titanothere was even larger than white rhinoceros today.
That's awesome.
By several hundred, if not maybe even a few thousand pounds. Early on in the Eocene, they were around. And it seems like as they died off at the end of the Eocene, these guys became more common.
Okay.
So in the later...
So lack of competition.
Yes, so in the lower layers, when I'm hunting the White River Formation, in the lower layers is where we find Titanothere stuff. And then as we get up higher, in the higher elevations, we start seeing more of these guys and no more Titanotheres.
There were North American rhinos until like 10,000 years ago, is that correct?
No. The last of the North American rhinos actually died out somewhere in the ballpark of 4 or 5 million years ago.
4 or 5 million years ago. Okay, so a lot of the other large mammals that did persist that long, why did the rhinos not make it as long?
So we believe that what happened was at 30 million years ago, the rhinos were getting better and better adapted for living in more open environments, because that's kind of one of the big things that was really changing about the world during the Oligocene. It was starting down the cooling, drying trend that would eventually lead to the Ice Age. That's throughout the entire Cenozoic era. So we see that these animals were getting better and better equipped for living in those environments, both from being able to feed on grass, because grass has existed since the mid-Cretaceous period, but we did not see vast grasslands. That was not a common environment up until after the Eocene. So during the Eocene, there was a lot more forests all over the planet. In fact, that's when the ice caps were still not present. Like Antarctica wasn't frozen at the time. So we see that these animals were doing better in the more open environment. So another thing that's interesting about them is that they did have kind of longer legs. It's where these animals get their name, which is their nickname, which is running rhino.
Interesting.
So that they were better adapted for being able to run long distances. And when the Titanotheres died out, this guy was actually the largest herbivore on the landscape that we know in North America.
In North America, because the Afrotherians hadn't made their way here
Correct.
Yet. Okay.
Yes. So in the White River Formation, following the extinction of the Titanotheres, Subhyrachodon is about the largest herbivore. It was not so large that it didn't have any predators, though, because at the time, they lived alongside certain kinds of predators that we don't have at all today. The animals that are commonly referred to as hell pigs.
Oh, yes.
Yes, the entelodonts.
Tell me more about those, because I've seen them for years. I grew up going to the Denver Museum of Natural History, and they have an excellent full-size one on display there. So cool.
So the species that lived alongside this guy is called Archaeotherium, and it was about the size of a small horse.
Okay, so quite a bit smaller.
So yes. But we'll get...
but still terrifying.
Yes. It's still an animal that was able to bring down these guys, and we see remains of Subhyrachodon that have bite marks that are from entelodonts is a very common thing in the White River Formation.
And they're not pigs.
They are not pigs.
What are they?
The way that I like to describe them is they are predatory land hippos.
Predator? That is fantastic. So are they actually over there closely related to whales?
Yes. They are as closely related to whales as hippos are.
Okay, so they're more closely related to hippos than hippos are to whales. That is so cool.
Yep.
And, that is just so cool. Okay.
And I think, honestly, so like referring to them as hell pigs is kind of something that science is trying to get away from, because they're not any closer related to pigs in all actuality than they are to any of the other artiodactyls are.
I don't know if we would know this at all, but were they foregut fermenters? A carnivorous foregut fermenter?
That's a good question. I mean, obviously, it's really hard to say because they don't have anything resembling a modern direct descendant.
Yes.
Because
the whales...
do
even though they're carnivorous. That is so cool. Okay, so thank you for going on that little aside with me. Okay,
it's important because we'll in another rhino that we'll discuss. We are not done talking about entelodonts.
Good.
So
I want to ask you how the North American rhinos got here, because I don't think they originated in North America, but we'll get to that question here in a little bit.
So Subhyrachodon, like I said, the largest herbivore that we have from the later half of the White River Formation. And it was not completely devoid of having any predators, but...
serious predators.
Right, exactly. And on top of that, there may have been some predation that some of the larger nimravids, which is a cat-ish thing. It is
but not a cat?
It is not a true cat. It is, however, a feliform.
Okay.
So it is.
So it's a giant civet of some sort.
So that's actually kind of almost a better way to describe them. But they were also saber-tooths.
Saber-tooth mega civet.
Yes.
this is why you're here.
Yes.
Okay.
The White River Formation is something that's really, really fascinating because it is one of those early times. For one thing, it's halfway in between the extinction of the age of dinosaurs and today.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good way of putting it.
Yeah. So the dinosaurs died out around 66 million years ago. This is around 30-ish million years ago. So we get a lot of those early mammals, and we have such an amazing fossil record that has been getting pushed up for the past 500,000 years by the Rockies that has exposed this absolutely amazing fossil record of all these animals. And a lot of them were preserved very, very well because there was a lot of ash in the sediment, and it did a really good job of preserving a lot of these.
Mm-hmm. I know they've got these incisor tusks. Mm-hmm. Did they have other sorts of head weapons? Because you said the little pygmy one did not.
Yeah, and it also didn't have these tusks. And these tusks probably weren't used as weapons.
Yes, you said for rooting around.
Yeah, it was probably more of a tool. But so one thing that caused these rhinos, and specifically these ones that have tusks, to do very, very well is that they kind of have teeth that was more well adapted for being able to feed on multiple different types of food.
Which is important because hindgut fermenters like rhinos are bulk feeders.
Yes.
I know at least the large-bodied rhinos that are alive today, they're eating around the clock. Mm-hmm. Like they eat this low nutrient food. They just have to eat, and they're not very efficient at digesting it, and so they just eat continuously. And so if you can't feed really efficiently, you can't be a rhino.
Right. So at this point is when that development really started to take off, because that is a adaptation that comes from, because grass is very nutrient poor. Mm-hmm. What we see from Hyrachodon, the smaller species, is it doesn't have the tusks, so it doesn't have those rooting tools. It doesn't have its molars are not as robust and able to grind up grass. So we think that Hyracoddon was more of a browser. Mm-hmm. And this guy, being a larger, longer-legged animal, it was probably living more open environments. So it was kind of like a case of niche partitioning, where you're going to have two different animals that are filling very different roles in the environment and being able to live alongside each other as a result without competing directly.
Okay, so these guys are being hunted by saber-toothed civets, saber-toothed megacivets, and hellspawn hippos. What are they competing with?
Honestly, when they started to get bigger like this, it kind of started to remove them for a while from a lot of their competition until some other animals start appearing in the fossil record. Like I said, this guy was the largest, but there was other herbivores that were smaller and probably more competition with Hyracoddon than Subhyracoddon. We have some of the earlier horses like Mesohippus, which is a three-toed horse that predominantly a browser.
Most people don't know that horses evolved in North America.
Yes.
They think of horses arriving in the Americas period with the Spaniards.
Yes.
They hadn't been gone for very long at all.
Right, exactly. So the horses that we have today are ones that their ancestors went across the Bering Land Bridge into Asia, Europe, Africa, and spread across all there. And
that's how the rhinos got here as well, correct?
Yes, more than once. Because these rhinos are actually separate from the rhinos that would show up later on.
Okay, how did that work?
So
that is so cool.
So we actually have that with a lot of different groups of animals, where there's actually been multiple radiations whenever that land bridge formed.
Mm-hmm. So it formed multiple times?
Yes. And it's what has allowed a lot of animals to migrate back and forth.
Do you know a ballpark of how many times and over what period of time?
That's hard. Yeah. Because...
That's a lot of times.
Right, yes.
Cool. And that makes some sense of some of the things that I know, because it's like there's some things that went this way, there's some things that went that way at different times. But if it wasn't continuously open, that makes it make a lot more sense. I never really hear it described that way.
So what we have, somewhere along the way, these rhinos started to die off. Probably because in one way or another, like this guy was doing better than Hyracoddon.
Which was competing with the small horses.
Right. But the horses started to become exclusively grazers and very well adapted for grazing. Apparently, at one point in time, the rhinos that were back in Asia were doing the same thing, because what was happening in the western United States was happening all over the world. As the climate was cooling and drying, the forests were disappearing everywhere, and it was being replaced by more open environments. So the rhinos that would cross into North America later would actually be represented, so they're not the direct descendants of these guys. What's really interesting, and this is getting into the next area that I wanted to talk about. There is about 35 miles away from where I hunt for fossils. There is a site called the Agate Fossil Beds, and it is about 10 million years more recent than this.
Okay.
So it puts us at about 19, 20 million years ago. And we either see examples of animals that are the direct descendants, seemingly, of the animals that I hunt for at White River, or other animals that have come in and basically are filling the exact same ecological niche. So in the case of the rhinos, we think that these rhinos eventually died off and were replaced by another small rhino that was about the size of a pony called Rhinoceros.
I would have called it Little Sebastian.
And this guy did have a little bit of a horn, but the horn was actually only present in the males.
Wow.
Yeah.
I've never heard of that in rhinoceroses.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
So we see
sexual dimorphism going on there.
And but
how much is the horn today used in male-to-male combat versus as a defensive tool against potential predators?
Honestly, it's kind of used like equally in both measures. Like it's a weapon on the animal's face. It works great for fighting rivals as well as fighting off predators.
That's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about it as much as a male-to-male combat tool as a defensive weapon, but obviously, if you're seeing sexual dimorphism where you've only got it in males, that is strongly indicated.
But the horn was not anything like so. For one thing, it was a 2-pronged horn.
Oh. Kind of spade-like?
Yes. So what you might be thinking of, this is actually a case of convergent evolution.
Okay, so what is that one I'm
because
thinking of?
the thing you're thinking of is actually the titanotheres. Those things from earlier.
That are not true rhinos.
Yes. And one of the main differences between titanotheres and true rhinos is the horns that are present on true rhinos are not bone. On titanotheres, it's part of the skull. Whoa. It's actually bone.
And it's bone. It's not. It's not.
The V shape is actually a bone. It's actually part of the skull.
Oh man! Is there any chance that it had like a keratinous sheath over it?
That's, I guess, possible. But it's kind of one of those things that, like, it's kind of hard to tell with that kind of stuff because keratin doesn't generally fossilize.
What did they use that shape for? Rooting around?
It could have been used for that.
This was in not.
Yeah, we're going back in time again.
Yeah, but on this group of rhinoceroses, you're saying that's the one that was only present in the males?
Yes.
Okay, but
it's a small V horn.
Okay.
They have the boss. They have a little bit of a boss on males. And it's got the 2 sides to it, but they're like the horn obviously wouldn't be present in the fossils. Mm-hmm. So with the agate fossil beds, we see, like I was saying, we see a record of, in many cases, either the direct descendants of a lot of the animals that I look for at White River, or animals that were somewhat related, but filling a very similar ecological niche. We think that Rhinoceros is separate from Subhyrachodon and Hyrachodon. Mm-hmm. So, but we do see animals like the tiny camels and horses that were present in White River have now started to grow bigger. One example is we see that there is a species of camel called Stenomylus. And that animal it's larger than the little camels that we see at White River. And for all intents and purposes, it's basically filling the same niche as antelope.
But it's a camel.
Right. It is a camel. Because just like with horses, camels actually first evolved in North America. Mm-hmm. Even though they don't exist here today, naturally.
Though in South America they are.
Yes. Yes. And that's actually the closest relative of some of the last of the Ice Age camelids that lived in North and South America.
Very cool.
But on top of that, Rhinoceros, that pony-sized one that we were just talking about.
With the split horn. Right?
Yes. It still had to deal with the entelodonts. Because the roughly small horse-sized Archaeotherium became the bison-sized Daeodon, which is the biggest of the entelodonts that we know of, and that was the undisputed top predator of North America.
Terrifying.
Yes.
And where were those found?
At the agate fossil beds, which is, like I said, like 35 miles from where I'm digging for
these. Okay, but just later in time.
Yes, we're talking about over this 35-mile difference. We're finding fossils that are about 10 million years after.
Okay.
And the direct and in many cases, the direct descendants of.
Well, that is astounding.
Yes.
The woolly rhinoceros. Where and when were they?
Those were predominantly during the Ice Age, where that's why they had that thick fur coat.
Which makes sense.
And to our knowledge, we have never ever found woolly rhinos in North America.
Wow.
They've all been in Eurasia.
Okay.
We don't know exactly why. There's theories as to why. So we think that the reason why they never migrated over, even when the Proboscideans were migrating over, is because they didn't have any driving force really pushing them across. They were, whatever food sources that they were utilizing was not something that was pushing them across the Bering Land Bridge.
Yeah. It's kind of amazing now that I think about it, that any bulk feeder would move across the land bridge during the Ice Age. What on earth were...
Well, they weren't moving across the glacier.
Yeah.
The times when they were migrating were times when there was a passage to be able to walk through. Yes.
Yeah, but like, would there be considerable amounts of plant growth?
As the glaciers were receding, it would take time, but eventually plant growth would start to return.
Mm-hmm. And those would be the only times that I would think organisms like that could possibly make...
Right, because, things like rhinos and elephants, they're not going to sit here and think like, oh, I'm going to travel over here and see what's over the next hill. That's a human thing. Like we think about doing stuff like that. They just look in front of them and go after whatever food that they have available, especially in bulk feeders. We have the agate fossil beds, 35 miles away from these guys. And that's an amazing piece of the fossil record. But in both cases of both White River and agate, those are both fossil that have been put together over the course of hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years. The next thing that is about 70 miles away from agate takes us forward to around 12 million years ago. And that was a fossil bed called the Ashfall fossil beds. And that one is in my opinion, one of the most amazing fossil locations in North America. It is in north central Nebraska, and they have found somewhere in the ballpark of 100 individual specimens of a rhino called Teleoceros. And this rhino is one of the largest North American rhinos. It was around the same size and weight as a black rhino, but it was almost kind of shaped like a hippo.
In the face?
In the body.
Wow.
Which is where they get the nickname barrel-bodied rhino.
Okay, I need to know more about these barrel-bodied rhinos.
So they also had tusks that were even more pronounced than what we see in these guys, even compared to modern rhinos. Mm-hmm. And there is a tiny bit of sexual dimorphism in them because even though both males and females have the tusks, the males had longer tusks.
Okay.
Ones that may have actually been long enough for them to potentially use as weapons.
Okay.
They had a small horn.
Males and females.
Yes. Both males and females had the nasal horn. So there is a theory they were somewhat like hippos in that they were partially aquatic. But one thing that we do know is that they seem to live in herds. They actually seem to have a fairly large social group. And we don't really see that a lot in any modern rhinos. Like that, they live together, but not like in large herds like what we're seeing from. Actually, it was present in both Teleoceros and Rhinoceros, the one from agate. And for Teleoceros, there's a theory that they may have been somewhat aquatic, kind of like hippos. That's something that's actually somewhat debated back and forth, but the body shape seems to point in that direction. If it looks like a hippo, it might live something like a hippo. The Ashfall fossil beds are really special because unlike with White River, which is a fossil bed that was accumulated over millions of years, and the agate fossil beds, which were accumulated over a couple 100,000 years, the Ashfall fossil beds were probably accumulated over the course of weeks.
In a single volcanic eruption, I'm guessing.
Yes.
Okay.
So hence the name Ashfall fossil beds. These fossils are, when I say that they are perfectly preserved, we talk and joke about how Jurassic Park has kind of painted this picture that like paleontology is like people going out and digging up these perfectly preserved animals. Like the whole skeleton is there, when in reality, in most cases, it's this. We'll talk about a little bit more about this individual animal toward the end, but most of the time you're picking up parts of bones, or if you're lucky, you might find a little bit of specimens that are all associated. In the case of Ashfall, we're talking about Jurassic Park style. You're finding whole skeletons laying there in the ground. They have found individuals, like I said, over 100 individual rhinos, all situated around this watering hole, all probably died within a few weeks of each other after a volcanic eruption. And we see males, we see females, we see calves. And they even have one specimen of a female that was pregnant.
Wow.
Yeah. This site was deemed so scientifically significant that they've done something that I thought was really, really incredible. They basically took the site and they built a facility around the fossil bed. A lot of these rhinos are still in the ground with a building that they call the Rhino Barn built over top of it. And it has a walkway where you can walk around and you can see these perfectly preserved rhino specimens in the ground. And I actually just came from there. I actually went and stopped there on my way out to White River this year. So it is, in my opinion, one of the most underrated and amazing fossil sites in North America, bar none.
And you've been touring all of North America, checking them out, so you would know. That's incredible. That seems like something worth seeing. And so where is that again?
That is in Royal, Nebraska, which is in north central Nebraska.
North central, okay. And then while you're out there, you can go to the zoo in Omaha.
Yep.
One of the best in the country.
Yep.
Nebraska has just joined my bucket list of places to really go and explore.
Yep. And like I said, all three of the sites that we've talked about are within 100 miles of each other. The White River fossil beds is a very large area. It covers a stretch of land that includes South Dakota, Wyoming, Nebraska, and Colorado. So it's a very large area, but within 100 miles of it, we have both 10 million years after that and showing a very complete fossil record of what animals were there 10 million years later. And then another 8 million years after that with ashfall, we have, and that's within 70 miles of agate. So we have like this perfect little snapshot of like the history of North American rhinos. And Teleoceros actually did survive after 12 million years ago when the ashfall fossil beds was formed. We actually see them very, very widespread. We've actually found them all the way over on the East Coast in places like Tennessee and Florida. And they are some of the last rhinos that lived in North America around 4 or 5 million years ago. And going back to a question that you asked earlier that I kind of purposely subverted because I was going to get there.
Yes.
We believe that the reason why they died out was actually because they started out kind of becoming more generalist and becoming like Subhyrachodon was able to feed on multiple different sources of vegetation. By the time we get to Teleoceros, which is one of the last North American rhino, we see them kind of going in a direction that sort of points to them being more specialized. And what it seemed like they were becoming more specialized was something akin to eating things like aquatic vegetation. As that cooling, drying trend continued, as we get into the Ice Age, because around 3-4 million years ago is when it started to really get to that point where the glaciers were starting to grow, and the first true ice age would start around 2 million years ago. It seemed like that was the thing that was pushing the North American rhinos to extinction. They became too specialized for something that was becoming less and less common of a way for them to make a living. Because we also see another group of animals, a group of proboscideans, that started to become, they didn't go extinct, but they started to become less and less successful as that happened. And it's believed that they were living alongside Teleoceros, the group of elephants called the Gomphotheres. They lasted longer than Teleoceros did, but they were definitely starting to get outcompeted by things like the mammoths, which mammoths are kind of perfectly adapted for living in the Ice Age environment, and not just in that they were, big elephants that were covered in hair. They were also good at grazing. They were good at processing grass, which became the most prevalent source of food.
And it wasn't just the woolly mammoths, but the Columbian mammoths as well. Which I don't think most people know about.
Right. And in fact, the Columbian mammoth is the most common mammoth species that we see in the Americas. You might have found woolly mammoths as far south as like maybe into Nebraska, but across the entire southern half of the United States, it was all Columbian mammoths. And then south of there.
Well, this has been extraordinarily informative. I cannot believe how much I always learn from you. It's like I realize there's just such a giant hole in my knowledge of what has happened between basically the end of the Cretaceous until almost right now. You know, and I see some of these ancient, especially large mammals. I'm kind of aware of that there's some of them that existed. A lot of them I had no idea. And like, this has got to be honestly one of the coolest times in history that almost nobody talks about.
Right.
Thank you so much for coming here. I do have, just for the record, I have one more really exciting question. It's on a kind of a different topic, but one I'm really excited to talk to Steve about, and we'll do that here in just a second. But I just wanted to first recommend that you go over and subscribe to Paleo Analysis. If you have enjoyed this at all, his channel is unbelievable. And just the amount of effort that he puts into his videos and how much he gives you a perspective on the actual biological history of the Earth, along with the geologic history of the Earth. Incredible stuff. Please go over there and check that out. Also, videos like this are kind of an experiment, but there's something I think that I would like to do a lot. And we can only afford to do these sorts of experiments thanks to the support of our patrons on Patreon. So if you would like to see more videos like this, or the extra video we have pretty much every week for our Stinkin' Rad fans on Patreon, please consider checking that out. But right now I do have one more exciting question, which is, I know you are a fan of the Xenarthra.
Oh, absolutely. That I have a list. I have so most of the field work that I've done has to do with Cenozoic mammals. That's kind of more something that has just happened. Mm-hmm. It's not like
because of what was around you.
Yeah, it's not because I don't want to study dinosaurs. It's that I live in Florida, and most of the field work that I've done outside of Florida is in northwest Nebraska, where there are mammals. So, but I have a list, and my list is and this is in no particular order. It's Xenarthrans, rhinos, Australian megafauna, the marsupials, like the diprotodontids and all that kind of stuff. And then the amphicyonids and the bears. It's actually kind of a list of 5 because I would separate those for sure. But like the bear dogs and the bears, the rhinos, the Xenarthrans, and the Australian megafauna.
Well, I just learned, and I we'll go into this shortly because I do intend to dig into them in a deeper way soon. But I just learned a few months ago about the marine Xenarthrans.
Oh yeah, okay?
I had no idea.
Yes, that is.
And I wouldn't mind if you'd spend maybe 2 minutes giving me at least a little teaser.
So the most well-known species of marine ground sloth that was somewhat marine is Thalassocnus. By giant ground sloth standards, it was fairly medium-sized. Mm-hmm. It was native to South America, and the problem with it is I think we have one pretty complete specimen, but a lot of the specimens of it are kind of fragmentary.
Is it from isotope analysis that we know that it's marine, or how would we know that?
There's actually a lot of the skeletal remains that have given us a lot of those clues. The bones are more dense in that species than even in other species of ground sloth, which is considerable. Yeah. They also have a slightly elongated snout, which would make it easier to be able to breathe underwater. And their limb bones, which I know you mentioned this in your phylogeny video, even by ground sloth standards, they apparently had very strong arms.
And the Xenarthra have already freakishly strong arms.
Yes. So this would have been, they weren't the biggest ground sloth. That still goes to things like Megatherium and Erematherium, but they may have been, pound for pound, one of the strongest sloths to ever live.
Well, this has been amazing and informative, and I appreciate you so much for being here.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Anytime, Clint.
And thank you guys for joining us as well. As always, like and subscribe. Hope to see you real soon.
Let me double check that.
Yeah.
My bad.
How dare you not foresee every question I might ask and know its answer? Well, you've had literally hours to think about this.
You literally gave me like 3 hours to write down some notes. And like, oh, Steve, you want to make a video? Okay. Well, I should have saw that coming.
I really ambushed you because I told you to be ready for rhinoceros questions.
Yep. And I said
hit you with the old giant ground sloth lives in the sea question.